This is the Vegas Huddle with Mike Davis.
Welcome inside the den, the Vegas Huddle. I'm your host, Mike Davis. Today we have a very special guest with us. Yes, this guy is the GM, the general manager of the NBA G League Ignite, who are changing basketball here in our community in Las Vegas. I'm so excited to have on the podcast one of my favorite people, and I just met him, GM Anthony McClish. Anthony, great to be with you. Thanks for being here. So much to talk with you about. I know when we met a few weeks ago at practice, I had taken to so much of your journey. This is what I want to know. Before we get into everything, the devotion that you've had on this ride so far, it's remarkable. I've never seen somebody so young, so youthful, who's got so much going on. Not only are you the GM of the Ignite, you're also going back and forth to University of Michigan Business School, getting your, executive MBA. Tell us, what you got going on, daily life, daily grind of a, general manager for the NBA G League Ignite.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's great to be here, and feelings mutual as it goes for you. We leave for Singapore tomorrow. That's the most tangible thing. So we have a 3-game trip to Singapore. So this past week, for example, was setting up the logistics for that. So that's the flights and sending in our rosters and our hotel and doing our practice schedule. Everything that goes into that 27-person travel party, across the world for 3 games. We moved into a new practice facility today in partnership with the city of Henderson, which is awesome. Our players are super excited about that. So we moved in. Now we have to, as people know when they move, we have to unpack and we have to get situated. And so we have that going on as well. And then last week we hosted the Perth Wildcats for 2 international exhibition games there at the Dollar Loan Center in Henderson. And so that's been my last 10 days or so.
It's a lot going on, but
yeah.
You've had the best training anybody can ever ask for. And I think that's really in part because of the pedigree you have. So let's talk about this. So, what was most fascinating that I thought from the beginning with you is that you really wanted to pursue a career in women's college coaching. Mm-hmm. So you go to Ohio State and you're kind of
Ohio State.
Yes. Ohio State. And you're a manager of the basketball team, and you're doing a lot of that kind of stuff. At what point in your career did you start kind of visualizing, maybe it's not coaching, maybe this is more so management that I want to get into?
Yeah, I went to Ohio State. I cold emailed one of the coaches there, and I went on the people directory, and I picked the coach that had the nicest looking smile on the page. And I thought, well, she looks nice. And so I looked her name up. Debbie Black is her name. She's a former WNBA player, and she's been a coach at Ohio State for a long time. Jim Foster was the head coach at Ohio State, who I believe he's now retired, but I believe he's top 10 all-time men's and women's all-time wins list.
Oh.
So really good mentor for me right from the beginning. But I picked Coach Black and emailed her and said, hey, I'd love to come by practice and just observe, really, at that time. And she emailed me back maybe 10 days later. And she said, hey, our first practice is on Friday. Why don't you stop by? And I went to the first practice. I stopped by, and then I never stopped stopping by. I just kept coming. And that turned into a formal offer to be a student manager. And so at the time, over the course of my 4 years, fortunately, we had 3 WNBA draft picks. So a pretty high-level team. We'd win some conference tournament championships, regular season championships, made the NCAA tournament every year. And I used to work camps in the summer, so I go work. Muffet McGraw was at Notre Dame at the time, and I go to Xavier camp, work Ohio State camps. And so trying to network and receive the visiting teams and make sure they're taken care of to try to set myself up to be a GA. That was what I wanted to do, was get a master's degree, which I ended up, as you alluded to, doing that 12 years later. But I wanted to be a GA, get a master's, maybe be a director of operations or video something, and then maybe get into coaching. And so when I graduated from Ohio State 2012, I applied. I sent letters, to people who I had met. I'm not one of those people that sends out 1,000 letters and you have this kind of letterhead and generic thing. It was, hey, Coach so-and-so, following up on our conversation, people that I'd met before,
wow.
Right? I got no responses back, 0 for 39.
Really?
Not no responses on we don't have anything. Sorry, great to hear from you. It was just crickets back, like
Wow.
just straight
Nothing.
ignore. Like if you and I were, like if you and I were talking, and I just get up and walk out of the room. Like it was just complete,
Wow.
like an ignoring of everything. So, the year before I graduated, while I was working at Chris Mack basketball camp, when Chris Mack was the head coach at Xavier, one of the guys who was working the camp had just come back from Vegas, working at a place called Impact. And Joe Bunazar runs this training facility called Impact. At the time, it was on Sunset, just south of the airport. And he kind of told me his story, gave me a point of contact there. I emailed that person and ended up coming out here summer my junior year, to work at the facility during the summer when NBA players would come in and they would just kind of train and try to stay in shape in the off season. So I did that my junior year. And then when I graduated my senior year, I graduated a quarter early because I had enough credits, finished at the NCAA tournament, and then came back and did that. That was pre-draft time. So agents will send their players there, train for the draft, get their nutrition right, all that stuff heading into the combine, and then NBA team workouts for the draft. And the San Antonio Spurs at the time were playing a playoff series against the Utah Jazz right up the street. So their two assistant GMs and one of the guys in scouting came down to watch workouts. And one of the assistant coaches at Ohio State, as you can see, this is all intertwined, right? This is kind of the way sports works. But one of the assistant coaches at Ohio State named Chris Gent had worked in Cleveland with the then assistant GM in San Antonio, Danny Ferry. And Danny was the GM in Cleveland. LeBron's first run. And so got their contact information, introduced myself briefly in person, applied to their internship program, got into that, was accepted into that, and then I've kind of gone on the last couple of years. But yeah, I wanted to be a women's college basketball coach, and just that wasn't in the cards.
And I'm seeing the parallels. There's so many people that come and sit in the same chair that you're sitting in, and it's like putting an outpouring of effort and energy into the universe to try for something, and then also a give and take where the universe kind of, shifts and shapes your journey a little bit more than you were even imagining. But let's talk about the Spurs organization, because I think what you're doing here with the Ignite, it's, the cream of the crop, and the guys that are coming through this program are, changing the landscape of the NBA. So let's start with what you saw in San Antonio. I mean, I'm a big Popovich fan. What is the organization? Why is it such a well-oiled run machine in San Antonio from the inside looking out? Tell us.
Yeah, I was really lucky to be there at the time. This was a 2012-13 season. Kawhi's second year in the league. Tim Duncan, Tony Parker, Manu Ginobili.
Right.
We signed Tracy McGrady at the end of the regular season, heading into the playoffs. So those were that was a player group, right? Obviously, Pop was the head coach. R.C. Buford at the time was a general manager, who's now the president of the whole kind of Spurs Sports and Entertainment. So Pop and R.C. were kind of the cornerstones of both the coaching staff and then management front office. But that year alone, Pop's assistants were Mike Budenholzer, who went on to be the head coach in Milwaukee, won a championship. Brett Brown, who went to be the head coach of the Philadelphia. Ime Udoka, who's now a two-time head coach. Will Hardy, who's the head coach at Utah. It was the assistant video coordinator at the time. Taylor Jenkins was the head coach of the Austin Toros of Memphis. The D-League, who's now the head coach in Memphis. Then on the front office side, and I think I'm probably missing one in there, on the front office side, it was Scott Layden, who went to be the GM of Minnesota. Trajan Langdon, who's now the GM of the New Orleans Pelicans, was a regional pro scout based out of D.C. at the time. Sean Marks was the GM of the same Austin Toros, now the GM of the Brooklyn Nets. So I had a ton of established mentors there, and I tell RC this all the time. To his credit, and I didn't realize this in the moment, but in reflection, there were people who were very comfortable with themselves as people, to then enable, they empowered then other people, and they allowed young people like myself to be in meetings. I I didn't do anything in the meetings besides take notes and make sure that things were printed on time, but I was in the room. And that was how I learned. And I still remember when the same Dennis Lindsay and Danny Ferry had just left. They were the assistant GMs that came down to that workout. Dennis went to become the GM in Utah. Danny went to Atlanta, I believe. And so RC was going through the process of hiring a new assistant GM. I joke with him and say that he hired me to replace Dennis because chronologically that was what happened. But of course, I was an intern at the time. But RC brought me in his office. One of the first things RC ever asked me to do was to help him go through kind of the organization and the process of the kind of the behind the scenes look of hiring an assistant GM. Well, in that, those guys had been there for so long, and Pop's assistants had been there for so long. So in finding the next one, he really had to explain everything about the Spurs to that person, to these candidates. And of course, one of the candidates ended up being Scott, who was hired, who's a good friend of mine to this day. But in doing that, he kind of outlined everything that had been successful with the Spurs up to that time. So that was how I learned.
So what were those things? I mean, tell me, like, if in a brief, kind of encapsulation, what are those pillars that make the Spurs the Spurs?
Yeah, well, they had a set of values that they don't compromise on. Character, selflessness, pound the rock were their three values that are unique to them. And so that scales across. That was both for, how we select players. That was how we run a medical meeting. That was, kind of just how they behave on a daily basis. But I think the biggest thing that I learned was the integration of the various functional areas within the organization. So you hear a lot in sports about, well, the GM and the head coach don't get along. And, the conflict between now analytics and coaching, sports performance or sports medicine and coaching, right? You see all these conflicts, right? There were very few of those there because the people leading the respective departments had been there so long. Again, they were very competent. They were very comfortable with themselves and each other to be open. They understood that we're all wearing T-shirts with the same logo on it, and so we need to embrace some of the the different motives of the different groups, but all working in the same direction. So there was a high level of integration, whether that be from the scouting department to the coaches, medical with the coaches, analytics into scouting, like all these different functional areas, high level of integration because of the leadership of Pop and RC respectively.
Let's get into the Ignite and what makes the Ignite special. So before we do that, I mean, let's set the stage. So, traditionally, when you and I were growing up, top basketball players from, their region, from their states, guys like Ron Holland, who's, now, the top guy with you guys. I mean, he comes from Duncanville, and, he's the best player in Texas getting recruited. He's McDonald's All-American. Back in the old days, those guys would just go to the elite programs, the Ohio States, the Kentuckys, the Dukes, all those types of places. Now there's a shift, and I think the first person I recognize really making a lot of these electives, I mean, back in the old days, high school players would go straight to the NBA too. We know that with T-Mac and LeBron and Garnett, bunch of different guys. But when it was instituted that you need another year out of high school of eligibility, we saw a lot of one-and-dones. We saw players doing different things. Brandon Jennings goes to Italy or something before even electing to go to a college. He'll do that, make some money, and then go to the NBA. Now we're seeing the G League Ignite in particular become this haven for incredible prospects. You have Ron, you have Modest. Now people are electing to do that over going to UT. I think Ron wanted to go to UT, and then he decides, I'm going to come to the G League Ignite. And he told me, quote, I chose the Ignite because it will help me reach my potential. Mm-hmm. Tell me how the G League Ignite is helping players like Ron reach their potential.
Yeah. The first thing I would say is not for everybody, right? Like I think there was this misconception when Ignite was launched a couple years ago. We were trying to disrupt college basketball. That's not the case. We all love college basketball and college athletics, and it has its place. And as you mentioned, I spent a lot of money going to school, so we're not anti-school or anti-college. But for a select group of players with a goal of becoming a great NBA player, and meaning all-star 15, 18-year career, which is really rare, right? If that's your goal and you have that elite type of potential, this is the place for you to be. And we could get into the on-court, off-court, all of it. Let's start with the team. You're playing with pros. So the very best college basketball team in a given 5-year stretch might have 3 or 4, if they're lucky, future pros on the team while they're in college. Right. That's an anomaly, though. We have that every day, every year, no matter what. Every single player is a pro. So in Ron's example, Matas Buzelis, who's another really highly rated player for us, had already committed to us. We had 2 projected first-round picks that were on the roster currently. So Ron knows this coming in. Right. A lot of times when you're the guy in high school, you're the 5-star recruit, McDonald's All-American, all of that, you're going to a place and they're saying you're the guy. Right? Ron is going and saying with us, in Ron's case, I want to be one of the guys. Of course, then he now wants to be the best that he can be, but he knows what he's getting into coming in. I want to play with other great players, which is one of the biggest hurdles that I've seen in my career with players going from pre-NBA in whatever capacity to NBA is, well, now if I'm Dyson Daniels, who we had a couple years ago, I'm the starting point guard for the Ignite. I'm playing next to Jaden Hardy, who was a draft pick for the Mavericks. I'm playing next to Scoot Henderson, who was a number 3 overall pick. I have to learn to play with other really good players. And so now Dyson does that with Ignite, and now he's going to go play with Brandon Ingram, CJ McCollum, these guys who are all-stars, and now I have to acclimate. Well, he's already gone through that process of figuring out what am I really good at. Because the other thing, too, is these young guys, rightfully so, are probably the best player on every team they played on for the last 6 years of their life, from the time they're like 12 to 18 or 11 to 17. I'm the best shooter, rebounder, ball handler, athlete, whatever. Now, a Leonard Miller last year, who was a draft pick in Minnesota, he led his team in every statistical category for as long as he can imagine. Well, now all of a sudden he's not the best shooter on the team because we actually have a guy who's got an Olympic gold medal, former first-round pick of the NBA named John Jenkins next to him. So I'm not going to shoot all the balls. And so you have that type of dynamic coming in of I'm really, really good, but what am I elite at? And how do I contribute in a professional game every single time? Because that's what an NBA head coach is going to require you to do. And so you have that process. Every day on the team, that's your competition, is each other. Then and it's really a commentary on the G League as a whole, the competition that we play against is pro. They're NBA players. Half of the players that we play against, half of the NBA currently rostered players have G League experience, over half, I think, now.
Wow.
So within the first 2 weeks of the season, last year, we're playing against Ousmane Dieng, who was first-round pick, Ochai Agbaji, who was a first-round pick, in addition to players such as Jamias Ramsey, who was on an NBA roster for a long time. Trey Burke was a matchup for Scoot Henderson last year, who was the National Player of the Year lottery pick 10 years ago. Right. The guy's still a pro from Michigan. And so this is Scoot Henderson's competition. Right. So now when Scoot goes to the NBA, he's already played against pros.
Right. It makes a huge difference. And so on court, I think we get that idea. The other thing that I just love from being an outsider and having been to a couple practices now is seeing just the way it functions like an NBA organization. What's your dream? Do you have a new dream? Do you have a vision for what you want to achieve? What does Anthony McClish want in 25 years?
Yeah, I don't. Taking my own advice, I don't have a title or a set of achievements or something. A trophy is just something that kind of sits on the desk. But if you can, the most rewarding moments for me, which is what it makes Ignite special for me, is giving knowledge and giving experiences to those around you and learning from those around you. And that is how I think you really get value out of what you've been able to accomplish. It's one thing to work for a Hall of Famer or be around Hall of Fame players. That's great. I could just keep that to myself, right? I was around Vince Carter, for example. It was an amazing person, an amazing player. Well, the value of me being around somebody like that and being put in those positions, how do I show gratitude for that, and how do I use that to its max is I can then transfer those experiences and that information and that knowledge to someone else, such that then they can pay it forward. And hopefully, as you iterate on that, everyone around you is a little bit better than they would have been otherwise. And so that's the value of Ignite again, is this is our job. Our job is to share information and to help other people. And we do it through basketball.
Wow. So much knowledge in this room, I have a headache. I mean, I've learned so much. The great Anthony McClish, thanks for being here.
Thank
the
you so
GM
much.
of the NBA G League Ignite. How much were those McNuggets when you used to buy that
$4.99.
$4.99. I wonder if they're this. What year was that?
This would have been 2011, 2010.
I wonder with inflation, they're probably a little bit more.
Yeah, it could be. Yeah, and they might not give you the breadth of sauces that they
See,
give.
which,
You could pick
what
whatever
was your sauce? I
It
should
was
ask.
like the sweet and sour, I think,
sweet
or
and
the,
sour,
or the
yeah.
chili, maybe
Yeah.
something one of those.
Sweet chili or one
yeah,
of those.
something like that. Yeah.
Awesome. There you
Yep.
go. We learned everything
Yeah.
about this great guy. Guys, listen, this is the Vegas Huddle. You can listen, subscribe wherever you get your podcast. This is also going to be on the Silver State Sports and Entertainment Network. And of course, we got so much great content coming your way when it comes to the NBA G League Ignite. You're not going to want to miss that. The great Anthony McClish. Thanks so much for being with us. We appreciate it, my man.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate it.
See you next time.